Everyone in town loves Frockle's fantastic sour lime caramels. I live in a really small town in the middle of nowhere called Hickling. Hickling is so small and boring that everything here comes in ones. We have one cinema, one supermarket, one high school, but most importantly one candy shop. The candy shop is run by an old gentleman named Maximilian Frockle. He is a sweet old man with gray hair, colorful clothes, and a fluffy beard. He looks nothing like his twin brother Maurice. Maurice Frockle is the town's gynecologist. While he always wears the cleanest shoes, the nicest suits, and has his hair perfectly groomed and dyed in the color black, he is just as sweet as his brother. The Frockle family moved to Hickling before my parents were even born. My grandpa once told me the story of their business. Maurice had just opened his doctor's office and Maximilian bought one of the old buildings in town to start the very first and only candy shop. His high expectations quickly evaporated, and hadn't it been for his brother, he would have gone bankrupt right away. The candy Maximilian sold was very peculiar. Instead of the typical chocolate, fudge, and gummy bears, his candy had the weirdest shapes and colors. It was too eccentric for the old-fashioned townspeople of Hickling. They were not acquainted with these new tastes, and Maximilian was lucky if one sold per month found its way to his shop. For almost a year the shop was closed. Maximilian was experimenting with new combinations and finally presented something he was terrifically proud of. He named it Frockle's Fantastic Sour Lime Caramels. Unfortunately, those were a big bust as well. He tried everything he could, put up signs, was giving out free samples in front of the store, but people seemed weirded out by it. As my grandpa said, they didn't want to take some crazy kind of candy from these people who were strangers to the close-knit community of Hickling. Luckily, Maurice was a lot more successful with his business, with the nearest hospital being about 2 hours away. Soon every woman in town visited his office. The brothers were smart and came up with a strategy. They would give out free samples of the sour lime caramels to the pregnant women who were not as opposed to the peculiar flavors of the candy. There are many studies demonstrating that a child can acquire a certain taste even before birth. When a mother eats a lot of a certain type of flavors during pregnancy, the child gets a similar tendency. It can work for spicy food, sweet treats, or in the case of the Frockles, sour lime caramels. And boy did it work. Maximilian had to wait a while, but as soon as the first children were born and grew older, they all seemed to crave the sour lime caramels. My grandma had been one of the women going to Maurice, and my mother seemed to be completely obsessed with Frockle's candy and especially the sour lime ones. When she was pregnant with me she was craving them more than ever. She told me on many occasions how I would always kick in her tummy when she had one of the caramels. My grandparents passed away when I was only 6, but I always loved hearing the story about the Frockle Brothers when my grandpa would tell it. He told me it took some time, but soon the town changed into what it is now. A through and through happy place with the best damn candy in the world. Only one thing stayed exactly the same over time: everyone in Hickling loved the Frockles. The brothers became everyone's best friends. Well, everyone in town is friends with each other anyway. That happens when you live in such a tiny place where everything is connected. All the kids go to the same school. A lot of neighbors work at the same places or go to the same clubs. Hardly anyone ever leaves the town, and if they do, they never stay away longer than a weekend. I once asked my father why we never go on holidays, like the people in TV shows, and he said, "Honey, those people go on vacation to escape from their lives for a little while. Why would we want to escape? We live in the most fantastic place on earth." He smiled when he said it, but I swear I saw his eye twitch nervously. He was right. I didn't mind that we never left. I used to love the town when I was younger. My best friends Miles and Kristen lived on the same street, and I spent almost every day with them. We were born in the same year and went to the same kindergarten, elementary, middle and high school. We grew up to become inseparable. I loved those two, especially as they were only children just like me. This town had most things a kid could wish for, but I had always wanted a sibling, a brother to be specific, and when I was 9, I almost got one. I was at the doctor's office with my parents when Maurice Frockle gave my mom the wonderful news that she was pregnant. My mother broke down in tears on the spot. There, no reason for tears. Those are some wonderful news. A child is always a blessing, Maximilian said while gently squeezing my mother's shoulder. My mother pushed her teeth together and forced out a smile. "Sweetie, why don't you wait outside and play with the toys?" she told me. Mr. Frockle gave me a piece of sour lime candy and pointed towards the door. I walked out, but as the nosy little kid I was, I made sure to leave the door open just enough that I could hear what they said. "This can't be possible." "Oh, but it is. I hear a healthy heartbeat. And look there, it's a boy." I had to really control myself not to jump up and down on the spot. I had always wanted a brother. Maurice started humming while he examined her further. "I'm quite surprised that you didn't notice yet. I was sure I wasn't able to birth any." "Well, then it is a true wonder child. How marvelous." I didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but I remember the last thing Maurice said to my mother as we were about to leave. "A boy or a girl? What do you prefer?" Back then I didn't understand why he would ask that, as he had already told her it would be a boy. My mother didn't stop crying, and when she told my dad the great news, he did something I never saw him repeat again. He punched the wall so hard that his hand started bleeding. And then they both just cried. They sent me to my room, but I heard them whisper all night long. I still don't know exactly what they said, but the next day they packed their bags and left for the weekend. It was the only time my parents ever went on vacation while I stayed at Kristen's home. When they came back from the weekend, Mom wasn't pregnant anymore. I wanted to scream and shout. I had never felt this devastated before. Mom didn't even look at me. She went straight to her room and I heard her cries through the walls. That's when I calmed myself down. I didn't understand everything that was going on back then, but I hated seeing my mother hurt like that. She was usually such a cheerful person. Dad tried to keep up the happy attitude he always had, but I could see that he was struggling. When I asked for an explanation, he told me, "It's something you can't understand yet, but just know that we would do anything to keep you safe. Your mother and I, we love you very much, and isn't that enough? We are just happy to have our one precious child." Maurice and Maximilian Frockle paid us a visit the following day. Maximilian gave me a big bag of candy and my parents sent me outside to play with my friends. As I walked out, I heard loud shouting and thumping coming from inside. I was just about to run back inside when the shouting turned to laughter. They sounded cheerful. When I came back home in the afternoon, my parents acted completely differently. They were happy. My mom was humming and making food. My dad was playing on the piano. He smiled when he saw me come inside. I wanted to ask them about the bruises they suddenly had on their arms and faces, but they acted so strange that I was afraid to ask. And they seemed genuinely happy. We never talked about the incident again, and the topic of siblings had become a taboo in our house. None of my friends had brothers or sisters. It didn't matter that I didn't either. Only as I grew older I started realizing that it wasn't just my friends and I. Nobody in Hickling had siblings. The only ones that came as two were the Frockles. When I was about 15, Miles, Kristen, and I started resenting the town more. We weren't kids anymore and we wanted to see the world. Hickling had nothing to offer to us besides Frockle's candy, and we were awfully bored all the time. You can't imagine how excited we were when a new family moved to our street. There were hardly ever any new people in Hickling, and it was even stranger that there was an available house. Nobody ever moved away voluntarily. We got even more curious when we saw that the new family had children. You read that right, plural. We were just sitting in front of my home trying out our skateboards when we saw a boy outside of the house. He looked about our age. He's cute. Let's go and say hi. Kristen jumped up from the curb. Are you sure? We don't know them. My parents didn't say anything about a new family, I responded. Don't be such a wuss, Sammy. Finally something is happening. So the three of us walked over to see this new boy. He looked about our age, had blonde hair, and freckles all over his face. After chatting with him for a while, we found out that his name was Charlie. He was 14 and had a 2-year-old sister. My uncle lived in this house. We came to visit a little while ago, and since then my parents were obsessed with this town. I honestly don't understand why. This place is so ducking weird, he said after we introduced ourselves. It is the most boring place on earth. The only good thing is let me guess, Frockle sour whatever caramel shit. Yeah, my parents talk about it all the time. My uncle did too, Charlie interrupted Kristen. Wait, is your uncle Jeremy Clerkins? I was already wondering why he'd move away. Makes sense that you just moved in with him, I said. We're not moving in with him. He died. The three of us didn't respond. While it wasn't unusual that people of Hickling would pass away out of nowhere, nobody ever talked about it as bluntly as this boy did. I was just about to say something when a woman walked outside with a little girl in her arms. The girl's hair was just as blonde as Charlie's and she held a little pink teddy bear in her hands. Oh, look at that. You must be the neighbors. How lovely to meet you. See, Charlie, there are kids just your age here. His mom seemed just as cheerful as our parents. Charlie rolled his eyes. My husband and I were just gonna settle in and then come around and introduce ourselves to everyone here. But first we are awaiting two gentlemen. Charlie, will you go inside and help your dad? She continued. She gave us a last smile and followed him into the house. That afternoon I heard a lot of screaming and shouting coming from the house of the Clerkins. My parents acted like they didn't hear any of it, so I did the same. Later that night someone rang our door. It was the woman, Charlie's mom, and a man who I imagine was his dad. Hello there. We just moved in on the opposite side of the street. I am Peter. This is my wife Helena. The Frockles paid us a visit already and gave us a big basket of that wonderful candy. We thought we'd share some of it with our lovely neighbors as well. My mom was just about to say something, but I interrupted her. Where are your kids? Kids? We only have one child. Sweetheart. He is a bit grumpy. Hasn't gotten used to the new house yet. She shot my mom a look who nodded understandingly. But what about the little girl? Shush now. Sammy. Don't be so nosy. My dad exclaimed. The face of Mrs. Clerkins started twitching. Finally, she said, why don't you go over and say hi to Charlie? Maybe you can show him how wonderful life here actually is. Her husband let out a loud sigh. We've tried everything. Please, maybe you can convince him. I walked over to the yellow house on the opposite side of the street. With a strange feeling in my gut, I rang the bell. Hello. The door was open but the lights were off. I slowly walked inside the house. I'd never been inside the house of Mr. Clerkins, but it looked pretty much like our home. I heard some noises coming from the living room. It sounded like whimpering. As I got closer, I saw someone hunched down on the ground. It was Charlie. He didn't look at me. He just kept staring at something in his hands. It was a teddy bear. The one that the little girl had in her arms earlier, but it was full of blood. I walked over and reached inside my pocket to get out one of the little sweets. I'm sorry, I whispered. Try this. It will make things a bit better. I promise. His tear-filled eyes met mine for a moment before he accepted the Frockle's fantastic sour lime caramel. Of course, I always knew that Hickling wasn't a normal town. Nobody from the outside ever came to visit. The ones that did would never leave again. Children disappeared all the time. Buildings randomly burned down. I could swear that once an entire street simply disappeared, including everyone that lived there. But nobody here cared about the irregularities. We were happy here. And life here can be good. We have everything we need. We always get the most incredible candy. I don't think I could ever live at a place without Frockle's fantastic sour lime caramel. I grew up never leaving town and got married to the best person I could ever imagine. We have our one home, one car, and one life together. We are happy. We have everything that we need. Maurice was incredibly kind yesterday when I went to his office. He even gave me a free bag of candy, but for some reason, I can't be happy about the good news. Not since I found out that I am expecting twins. I realize that to someone who has never been to Hickling, our way of life can seem strange. When I was younger, there were moments where I wondered if this was really the way to be. Even if I had never spent much time outside of our town, I always knew that the world must have much more to offer. But then again, the world isn't perfect. We have learned about war, crimes, and serial killers in school. The outside world isn't that much better than Hickling. Hate, anger, sickness. We didn't have any of those things. We had candy and we were happy. At least that's what I was told every time I showed any signs of concern. Everything here is beautiful, Sammy. We can't simply leave that behind, is what my parents told me when I was younger. We can live our fantastic life in Hickling or not live at all, is what they said as I grew older. There never was an option to leave, is what I've learned now that I am older. Life isn't as simple as we think when we are young. We all have to do something to get by. I learned to understand that eventually. And Hickling is a special place. Of course, we had to stick to the rules of our community, but wouldn't you as well? If your payment was a life that was absolutely perfect. Our butcher always has the freshest and juiciest meat, even though there are no animal farms close by. Nobody here is ever jealous of anyone. You can go outside on your own in the middle of the night and have nothing to fear. We might only have one out of everything, but the places we have all work extraordinarily well. As we graduated, I hardly saw my friends Miles and Kristen anymore. They had started dating and I was quickly out of the picture. Well, that is one reason. The other one is that I kept inviting Charlie to spend time with us, but my friends seemed to feel fed up with him quickly. A lot of townspeople didn't seem to like him. He was too grumpy for their taste. Of course, these are only assumptions, as no one in Hickling would ever directly say anything negatively. Charlie wasn't a fan of Frockle's wonderful candy store. He must have been the only person in the entire town that had anything bad to say about the sour lime caramels. His parents tried very hard to silence him. They came over all the time to make me convince him. And I tried. I really did, but he was different. At times he was happy and jolly, just like everyone in the town could sigh in relief. When he had bad times, his mother wouldn't let him leave the house, but everyone knew what was going on. There was only one possible reason why he was not participating in the town's activities, or why he wouldn't come to school for days, and why he looked sick when he did show up. Everyone knew. Even the brothers. Charlie didn't eat the candy. He was the first person I had ever met who had a problem with Frockles. Even Kristen, who often tried to act badass, was going along just like everyone else. Charlie was different, which is probably the reason I felt so drawn to him. His parents would sometimes lock him up in his room with nothing but candy, hoping the hunger would force him to take some. Sometimes it worked and he would come to school with the biggest smile on his face. When I wouldn't see him for a few days, I would try and climb up to his room to give him some other food. I knew it wasn't a long-term solution because he would only throw up and look even worse, but when he had those candy-free periods, he would tell me things nobody else did. How our life was far from perfect. How we had to somehow get away, but that the chances of that happening were close to zero. Charlie was the only bit of darkness in Hickling and I loved it. We just had to make sure to hide it. Eventually, he had to give in or he would have starved. He became a real part of Hickling. A happy citizen with a belly full of Frockle's fantastic sour lime caramels. Sometimes I missed his dark side, but at least this meant that we actually had a future together. When we were 22, we got married and moved to our very own house. We didn't have to take care of anything. The town simply gave it to us after the family that lived there before passed away. Apparently they decided to go on a vacation. One weekend. Not more. But on their way back, It started storming and their car broke down. They had never spent so much time away from Hickling before, and when they finally did come back, they were so sick that they all died within a day. Not even the candy could help anymore. They had no family, and people in Hickling don't mourn anyway. So life just continued, and we got a perfect new house. It looked the same as the ones we grew up in, but it was closer to the center of town, which was perfect because we could actually see Frockles from our windows. Charlie got a job as a teacher and I was hired to take care of the Hickling's newspaper. As the news here is basically the same every day, I had a lot of free time on my hands. So I was always the first in the shop in the morning when Maximilian made the fresh batch of caramels. For a while, our life went on well. Miles and Kristen and their little boy, Elliot, would come over a lot, or we would go to the Hickling's Hall of Movie and Entertainment, which had exactly one screen and would show one new movie every month. Life was great. More and more people started disappearing. Eventually even our parents, but at least we always had enough to eat. Life was fine. When Charlie had little moments of darkness, we simply kept to ourselves. Life was okay. When Maurice gave me the news of my pregnancy, the illusion that I had built up about my life shattered into little pieces. The only time in my life where I had ever felt remotely close to this sadness was when I got the news that I wouldn't get a brother, even with the lack of understanding I had. I felt it deep inside of me. I could never choose one of the kids, just like my mother. I broke down in tears sitting in the office of Maurice Frockle. He didn't comfort me or tell me about the joy of a child, the way he did with my mother back then. He almost looked sad himself. Not that Maurice ever showed any negative emotions. As he reached over to hand me a piece of sour lime caramel, he whispered, "I hope you choose to keep the good one. Are you not feeling sick?" I could tell that Charlie tried to smile. These were happy news. After all, we were expecting a kid. But just like me, he was aware that this news was tainted in a dark color. The evil thoughts that we tried so hard to block out, they were making their way back up. Of course not. No woman in Hickling feels sick during pregnancy. Silly. I feel fantastic. God, you know how much I hate that ducking word. His pale face was turning red. It's been a long time since you've cursed. Bad words aren't very jolly. Have you had any Frockles Fantas? No. And I won't have any of that poison anymore. And you won't either. We need to get out of here, Sammy. You have changed. We've both changed. We need to go. Before Charlie gagged before he could finish the sentence. He had always been more immune than the other people here, but even Charlie couldn't survive too much time without the candy, and he knew it. He pulled me closer and held me for a moment which felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke. "I will take care of this. For you and for both of our future children." He got the biggest knife out of the drawer in the kitchen, and just like that he left the house. He gave no explanation, but I knew what he was intending to do. He wanted to murder the Frockle brothers. Charlie had spoken about this many times before, always in his sleep, even when he was happy and full of caramels. The hate inside of him always found a way to come out. I should have been scared. The brothers wouldn't hurt Charlie, but if the townspeople found out that their provider of sour lime caramel was brutally murdered, they would rip my husband to pieces. I should have been scared, but I knew that it would never come this far. I knew things would be fine when Charlie came back home, his clothes stained with blood, the knife in his hand. "The doc is gone," he said. "And the candy maker. I burned down his shop." I smiled and gave him a long hug. The blood was rubbing off on my clothes. I smiled because he was alive and because I had too. But I knew that this wasn't the end of it. Charlie went straight to bed. He was feeling even more ill and kept throwing up all night long. More than should be humanly possible. The next day, he could hardly get up, but as the sweet smell of caramels filled our street, he pulled himself up, grabbed the knife with stains of dried blood, and left our house. Again he was tainted red with the blood of the brothers. I stabbed both of them. He laughed as he said it. The next day he came home saying, "I threw a brick in the face of the candy maker." He collapsed right away. I nodded and gave him another hug. I knew he needed to do this, even if I had accepted long ago that it wouldn't change anything. Hickling was a curse and a blessing in one. "Hello, Maurice." I greeted the Frockle brother dressed in black. "Hello, love. I am sad to see that your husband did not take the news of your pregnancy too well." I didn't dare to look him in the eyes. "It's just difficult for him. You know, he wasn't born here." "I know, and I know how hard you are trying to keep him happy, but my brother doesn't like it when his candy making is interrupted. Can you at least make sure he only comes for me next time?" I nodded. "It's for your own good. The people in town are starting to resent your husband more, and they need their candy to stay peaceful." He winked at me and gave me a bag of caramels. It had Charlie's name on it, just like on that first day that we met. I walked to the crying boy that had now become a man and offered him the piece of candy. "Try this. It will make things a bit better. I promise." As always, I was the first one in the store. With everything that had happened lately, I needed the candy more than ever. I had no idea that this morning I would be the first one to see Maximilian Frockle's newest invention. I remember feeling extremely euphoric at that moment, thinking how I must be the luckiest person in the world to be the eyewitness of such an enormous change. I walked inside the bright and colorful store. The most wonderful combination of smells hit my face and I couldn't help but smile. Good morning, Sammy. Isn't it a beautiful day? It truly is. Mr. Frockle, there is only one thing I am missing and it's those fantastic caramels of yours. Well, then I have to disappoint you. Mrs. Clerkins, I don't have any caramels for you today. I felt a panic rush over me. This couldn't possibly be true. Never in my entire life had Frockles been out of caramels. I didn't say a word and already calculated how much candy I had left at home. Maximilian must have noticed the look of concern on my face because he started laughing. The town is shrinking, my love. Don't you know what that means? I shook my head. Well, it means that our work here is almost done. I cannot sell candy to a non-existent town. The people of Hickling were too greedy. They expected too much. You are talking nonsense, Mr. Frockle. The town is well and fine and we are still very much in need of you and your fabulous skills. He smiled even more. Fabulous. That is exactly the word I had been looking for. I didn't mean to scare you, sweetheart. Of course, I am not leaving just yet. I have something new to offer which I hope you will adore even more. I just had to find a way to name it. What do you think of Frockle's fabulous bittersweet peach gum? Bubblegum. I raised an eyebrow. Yes, it lasts longer than the caramels. Would you like to be the first one to try it? Not like this, brother. This was not how things were supposed to go. It's okay, Mr. Frockle, I chimed in. I understand this is what I have to do and I've made my peace with it. I just hope Charlie will understand. Every morning since we moved to the new house, I would get up, stretch, and open the big window in the bedroom. Usually, I would be alone for this as Charlie went to work pretty early, but this morning he hadn't gotten up from bed yet. He was really awfully sick and we were out of caramels. All I had were those fabulous bittersweet peach gums. I didn't want to hurt Mr. Frockle's feelings, but there was nothing sweet about that bubble gum. It tasted awful and I wanted to spit it out right after he gave it to me. That would have been rude though. So I chewed the gum and told him how delicious it tasted while I listened to the things he told me. Sometimes lying is important. For example, when you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, and I really didn't want to hurt Maximilian Frockle. Not after the agreement we had considering Charlie, the one secret that I'd kept. So that morning instead of having sour lime caramel I fulfilled my cravings with the disgusting gum. I felt fine, actually pretty clear, but I hated what this situation was doing to Charlie. After he finally accepted that he couldn't simply murder the brothers, he spent every moment that he wasn't throwing up with planning and scheming. I felt terrible for my poor, sweet Charlie. Yeah, maybe he was a bit different than everyone else here, but that doesn't mean he deserved any of what happened. I am getting ahead of myself. Charlie was still in bed, but he was doing a bit better. I knew how much he resented the caramel, so I offered him some of the fabulous bittersweet peach gum. I figured that he might even like it. With his weird taste buds and all. Is that what you're chewing on right now? Yeah, I said and made a big pink bubble that popped a second later. Charlie even laughed at the sight of it. I could tell he was thinking hard again, but then he threw the little pink ball in his mouth and started chewing. It's not too bad, he said and shrugged. I couldn't help but laugh at that. It's ducking terrible. For the first time in a week, Charlie laughed as well. For a moment we forgot about our troubles. His smile grew bigger. Bigger than I had seen in a while. He grabbed me by the shoulders and started laughing hysterically. Sammy, did you just swear? I shrugged. I didn't get what he was hinting at then. Sammy, did you have any of that Frockle's ducking caramel today? I hadn't, which was very unnatural for me. This was the first time since I was born that I didn't start my day off with the candy. And for the first time, I was absolutely fine with it. I didn't crave it at all. I even felt a bit revolved by the thought of it. Must be the pregnancy, he concluded. Wonderful evening to you. Mrs. Clerkins, is your husband home by any chance? It was our neighbor Mr. Gilster. He had a big smile on his face. This, normally wouldn't be too odd. I've never seen him not smiling. This one wasn't quite right though. He had pinned the edges of his mouth to his cheeks, making his voice sound slightly distorted. I am afraid not, I responded. Well, if that isn't a shame, would you know where he could be or when he will be back? I shook my head. I don't mean to make any trouble, love, but could you give me a heads up when Mr. Clerkins is back? I have a wee question to ask him. Absolutely, Mr. Gilster. I'll make sure to let him know. Bye now. I slammed the door in his face. He must have been the 10th neighbor ringing our doorbell only in the last 20 minutes. Each time someone rang the bell, their jolly looks were even more static. And they all asked for Charlie. They knew damn well that he was inside and that I was lying. So far they were still trying to be friendly and polite though. How many are they now? Charlie asked while making sure to stay away from the window. Like 40. Looks like their kids are joining as well, I said while staring at the mass of people in front of our home. Even more are in front of the candy store. Maximilian had put up the closed sign right after I had left with the bubblegum. Duck, Sammy. They all think it's my fault, but it's not. Ma. The doorbell rang. It was Kristen. Miles was standing right behind her. He was holding a bat with spikes hammered in. Sammy, we know he's in there. I can smell him. Kristen was pushing her teeth together, forcing the words to come out. We don't want to hurt you. All we want is some fantastic sour lime caramel. Sammy, you understand that, right? Right. Miles came closer. Just let us take him. We've decided. The whole town agrees. Listen, Sam. Nobody wants to hurt you. We all love you. You know that, right? We just want him. He needs to be punished and you know it. I hadn't even noticed that everyone else had come closer. The entire town was standing behind my friends, all staring and smiling while holding a variety of weapons. Sammy, go inside. Charlie whispered in my ear. Before I could even react, Miles and Kristen had pulled him outside. I couldn't even say a word or give him a kiss, let alone a hug. I had to watch how my husband was being ripped into pieces by the horrific people of Hickling. His blood was splashed over the concrete. They took what was left of him and taped it to the storefront of Frockle's candy shop. If there had been just a bit of doubt left inside of me, it was gone now. Maximilian and Maurice Frockle were standing inside, looking through the blood-tainted window of the store. In their hands, they were holding big bags filled with something that resembled the fantastic sour lime caramels, but instead of the typical caramel brown and lime green swirl, they were black and red. The people didn't care though. They all started clapping as the smell of caramel filled the streets once again. Nobody but me noticed how terrible the smell really was. It smelled rotten. The townspeople of Hickling didn't mind though, and they started cheering and shouting as the Frockle Brothers threw the peculiar candy into the crowd. They threw themselves on the ground and filled their mouths like pigs that hadn't been fed in days. It wasn't easy for me to stay calm, but I had to be patient and wait. As Maurice threw out the last pieces of candy, Maximilian cleaned up the bloody remains of my husband and brought what was left of him inside the store. I took a deep breath and held my stomach. One single tear rolled down my cheek as I saw the entire townsfolk of Hickling slowly falling to the ground like domino pieces. I could hardly get through to the store, fighting my way through the still bodies lying on the ground. As I reached the candy shop, Maurice greeted me with a sad look on his face. This was the very first time I had ever seen him without a smile. Are you sure about this, Sammy? Yes, Duck Hickling. We walked inside the store where Maximilian was putting Charlie back together. It might take a little, but he will be absolutely fine and healthy again. The bubble gum is even more miraculous than I imagined, Maximilian Frockle said excitedly. He gave me a big smile. I am so glad you decided to take over the store, Sammy. You were always my favorite person in Hickling. I am glad your parents chose for you to stay back then. It wasn't a very hard decision. I simply picked my family over everyone else. I sighed. They are not all dead. Right. I'll need to start somewhere. No. Maximilian laughed. Only a few. You'll need some fuel. Let's hope it's the awful ones, although they are all awful in their own way. I nodded. I wasn't lying. It really was an easy decision. After Maximilian Frockle gave me the bittersweet peach gum, I could finally think straight. As he told me the story of Hickling, I was in disbelief, but after seeing what these people did to my poor Charlie, it made a lot more sense. Little did those monsters know that neither of us would be dying anytime soon. The story my grandpa had told me years ago was only partially true. I don't know if he was too ashamed to admit the rest of it or whether they really all forgot, but there was a lot more to the Frockles. Maximilian and Maurice Frockle have spent all their life traveling the world to explore the finest locations and build up relationships with communities in need of some sweetness. Maximilian is the most marvelous candy maker in the world, and Maurice loves his brothers so much that he has been supporting every aspect of his profession. He knows that it is their destiny to share the candy with the world and ignite Maximilian's spark. They had only good things in mind when they found Hickling all those years ago, but the people here were nasty, cruel beings. They didn't accept any newcomers, especially not those who were in the slightest difference. While they tolerated the inconspicuous and clean-cut Maurice, they absolutely hated Maximilian and his store. They threw bricks into his store, painted degrading slurs on the window, and threw their trash and shit inside just so the wonderful candy store would smell and people would stay out of it. For no other reason than the fact that they couldn't deal with anything new or different or in any way creative. When one time a little girl found its way to the store, Maximilian was happier than he had been in years and offered her a free sparkling rainbow lollipop. The girl thanked him with a big smile on her face and ran home to show her siblings, who hadn't seen anything like this before. When the parents found out that Maximilian Frockle had given their daughter free candy, they started some terrible rumors about Maximilian doing awful things to the children, things that make me feel so sick I can't even think about them. Maximilian was heartbroken. Of course, none of it was true, but as the gossip made its way through the town, they all got together to beat him up the way they did with Charlie. That's when the Frockle brothers realized that Hickling was not a special place. It was hell, and they made it their job to clean it up. You know the rest of the story. Maximilian made his first batch of Frockle's fantastic sour lime caramels, and the town got addicted to it so much that they lost all control over their free will. The policy of one was introduced, and the town slowly became the beautiful utopia that it is today. Everything was exactly the same, just as the people wanted. One out of everything. No variety. With one exception. Of course, the two single people who were different. Maximilian noticed that the townspeople weren't as accepting as he Thought they were. They didn't tolerate the boy with the blonde hair and the freckles that had come into town. They were falling back into old habits. He had to finish things sooner than expected, even if Maurice didn't like it very much. With the gum, he made sure that Charlie and I would be well prepared to take over. We will make the most wonderful candy and live a happy and long life in the beautiful town that is Hickling, together with our 2 little girls. As for the Frockle Brothers, they will move on to the next town that is in need of some of their sweet caramel. So sweetheart, what will Charlie and you make out of my fantastic store? Maximilian asked as we got ready to say our goodbyes. I actually don't want to change too much. You did a terrific job here. That can't be denied. Well, except for one tiny change. I smiled as we took off the Frockle sign from the storefront. How do you feel about Clerkins' curious sour lime caramels?